Here is a question with a much more uncomfortable answer than you would expect. Soap is roughly 5,000 years old. We have written recipes for it from the Bronze Age. It shows up in Mesopotamian records, in Egyptian medical documents, in Roman natural history. By any reasonable measure, humans have known how to make soap for essentially the entire span of recorded history. And for almost all of that time, we had no idea what it was actually good for. People made soap for thousands of years and used it to clean wool. They used it to treat skin diseases. They used it to dye their hair. What almost nobody did for most of that history was use it routinely to wash their hands and bodies. And the reason is that nobody knew there was anything on their hands worth washing off. The gap between inventing soap and understanding soap is about 4,800 years, and the people who closed that gap were largely mocked for it while they were alive. Let's dig into this properly, because the timeline of soap splits cleanly into two very different stories. When we could make it, and when we finally knew why it mattered. Start with the chemistry, because everything else follows from one reaction that is remarkably easy to stumble into by accident. Soap is made from two ingredients, fat and a strong alkali. Fat is everywhere. Animal tallow, olive oil, palm oil, whatever your region produces. Strong alkali is also everywhere if you know where to look, because wood ash soaked in water produces an alkaline solution. Burn plants, pour water through the ashes, collect what drains out, and you have lye. Combine that with fat, apply heat, and a reaction called saponification occurs. The alkali breaks apart the fat molecules, and what you get is a salt of the fatty acids, plus glycerol as a byproduct. The resulting molecule has a peculiar shape, and the shape is the entire point. One end is attracted to water, the other end repels water and is attracted to oils and fats. That dual nature is what makes soap work. Grease and dirt do not rinse off with water because water and oil refuse to mix. Soap molecules solve this by surrounding an oil droplet with their oil-loving ends pointed inward and their water-loving ends pointed outward, forming a tiny sphere called a micelle. The oil is now wrapped in a water-friendly shell and can be carried away by rinsing. The same mechanism does something else that mattered enormously and went unrecognized for millennia. Many viruses, including influenza and coronaviruses, are wrapped in a membrane made largely of lipids. Soap disrupts lipids. When soap molecules reach that envelope, they pry it apart, and the virus falls to pieces. Bacterial membranes suffer similar damage. Soap is not just lifting germs off your skin, it is physically destroying a large share of them. The mechanical side matters as much as the chemical one. Soap loosens material, but rinsing and friction are what remove it, which is why the duration of scrubbing turns out to matter so much in hygiene guidance. 20 seconds is not an arbitrary number pulled from nowhere. It reflects roughly how long it takes for soap to penetrate, disrupt, and lift material from the folds and creases of skin, particularly around fingernails and between fingers where most people wash carelessly, or not at all. Nobody knew any of that until the 19th century, but the reaction itself is simple enough that people found it thousands of years earlier without any theory at all. Let's talk about what people used before soap too, because this represents the context that makes the invention look less inevitable than it seems. Humans were cleaning themselves long before anyone combined fat with ashes, and they had a substantial toolkit. Plain water and sand does more than people assume, since abrasion physically removes a great deal of surface material. Clays of various kinds were widely used, and some clays really do bind oils and lift them from skin and cloth. Certain plants contain saponins, natural compounds that foam in water and act as mild surfactants. And soapwort, soap bark, and soap nuts were used for washing across different regions of the world. Then there is the option nobody enjoys hearing about. Stale urine breaks down over time into ammonia, which is alkaline and cuts grease effectively. Roman fullers who processed cloth collected urine in pots placed on street corners for public use and worked it into wool with their feet in large vats. The practice was widespread and organized enough that it was taxed. Urine was also used in some places for laundry and reportedly for cleaning teeth, which is unpleasant to think about, and worked well enough that the habit persisted for centuries. Ash on its own, without added fat, was used directly as a scouring agent. Pumice and other abrasives handled rough cleaning. Oils were used both to clean and to condition skin, as the Roman method demonstrates. So the arrival of soap was not filling a vacuum. It entered a crowded field of existing methods, most of which worked adequately for their intended purposes, which is part of why adoption for personal washing was so slow. Soap was better, but nobody had a way to measure how much better, and the difference that mattered most was invisible. The earliest hard evidence comes from Mesopotamia. Clay tablets from Babylonian sites, dating back to around the 3rd millennium BCE, describe combining fats with ashes. Later cuneiform tablets give more specific formulas with proportions of oil and alkali. The stated uses generally point toward washing textiles and treating medical conditions rather than personal bathing. That focus on textiles is worth understanding because it explains a great deal about early soap. Raw wool is loaded with lanolin, a natural grease that must be removed before the fiber can be dyed or properly worked. Cleaning wool at any scale requires something that cuts grease. Textile production was one of the largest industries in the ancient world, and soap's first major role was industrial rather than personal. Egypt provides the next major evidence. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical compilation dating to around the 16th century BCE, describes combining animal and vegetable oils with alkaline salts to produce a substance used for washing and for treating skin ailments. Egyptian sources also indicate this material was used in preparing cloth. Let's talk about the Romans too, because this represents one of the most persistent misconceptions in the whole subject. Roman bathing culture was elaborate. Public baths were central to civic life, with heated rooms, cold plunges, exercise yards, and social gathering space. Given all that infrastructure, people usually assume the Romans were scrubbing themselves with soap. They largely were not. The standard Roman method involved rubbing oil onto the skin, sometimes with added scent, then scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The oil bound to dirt, sweat, and dead skin, and the scraping removed the whole mixture. It works reasonably well and requires no soap at all. Romans did know soap existed. Pliny the Elder describes a substance called sapo, made from tallow and ashes, and attributes it to the Gauls, noting it came in solid and liquid forms and was used on hair, specifically to give it a reddish tint. He presents it as a foreign cosmetic practice rather than a Roman cleaning method. That association with Northern European peoples appears repeatedly in Roman sources. Germanic and Celtic groups seem to have been making and using soap-like preparations while Romans were still scraping themselves with oil, which inverts the usual assumption about who was cleaner. By the 2nd century CE, the physician Galen was recommending soap for cleaning the body and clothing, and describing German soap as the best quality available. So the shift toward washing with soap does appear within the Roman world, gradually and later than the baths themselves. There is also a legend attached to all of this that deserves to be retired. The story goes that soap was discovered at a place called Mount Sapo, where animal sacrifices were burned, and rainwater carried fat and ashes down to a river, where women washing clothes noticed the water cleaned better. It is a tidy story. It appears in a great many popular accounts, and there is no ancient source for it, and no such place is known. It appears to be a much later invention constructed to explain the word sapo. Let's talk about what happened next too, because this represents the period when soap became a serious craft rather than an occasional preparation. The major advances came from the Islamic world between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries. Soap makers there moved decisively toward hardbar soap made with olive oil rather than animal fat, and toward more controlled alkali sources. The word alkali itself comes from Arabic, from a term for the ash of a specific salt-tolerant plant. Those plants, glassworts and saltworts growing in coastal and desert soils, accumulate sodium in their tissues, and burning them produces ash rich in sodium carbonate. That yields harder, better soap than ordinary wood ash, which is richer in potassium and produces soft soap. That distinction is the whole reason bar soap exists. Sodium-based soaps are firm and can be cut into cakes. Potassium-based soaps stay soft or liquid. Once soap makers could reliably obtain sodium-rich alkali, hard portable soap became possible. Several cities became famous for it. Aleppo produced a soap of olive oil with laurel berry oil added, cured for months until it developed a hard body and a pale interior beneath a darkened surface. Nablus developed its own long-running olive oil soap industry. These operations were substantial, organized, and exported widely. Islamic writers also documented the chemistry as far as it could be understood at the time, describing the preparation of alkali, the boiling process, and the addition of scents. Europe picked this up along Mediterranean trade routes. Regions with abundant olive oil had an obvious advantage, and Spain and Italy became early centers. Castile soap, made from olive oil, became a byword for quality. Marseille developed a major industry and eventually a set of standards governing what could be sold under its name. Northern Europe, lacking olive oil, mostly made soap from animal tallow, which produced a harsher product with a considerably less pleasant smell. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about medieval bathing too, because this represents another place where the popular story is mostly wrong. The standard image of the Middle Ages involves people who never washed, and it does not hold up well. Public bathhouses were common in medieval European towns, sometimes numerous enough that a decent-sized city supported dozens. They were social spaces, often with food and drink, and they were used regularly by people who could afford the entry fee. Written household guidance from the period includes instructions on washing hands before and after meals, and hand washing at the table was a matter of etiquette because most eating was done with fingers. What changed was later. Bathhouses declined substantially in the early modern period for several overlapping reasons. Outbreaks of plague and syphilis led to fears that communal bathing spread disease. Moral objections mounted as bathhouses became associated with prostitution, and firewood for heating water grew expensive as forests thinned. A theory circulated in some medical writing that hot water opened the pores and let illness enter the body, which encouraged people to avoid immersion entirely and rely instead on changing linen and applying perfume. So the least washed period of European history was arguably not the medieval one, but the couple of centuries that followed it, which is close to the opposite of what most people assume. Soap remained expensive, and governments noticed. England taxed soap for well over a century, with the tax lasting until the mid-19th century. Soap makers were subject to inspection, production was tightly monitored, and the cost put decent soap beyond the reach of poorer households for generations. Taxing soap while cholera outbreaks were killing people in crowded cities is one of the more grimly ironic policies in public health history. Let's talk about what finally made soap cheap too, because this represents the point where it stops being a luxury. The bottleneck was alkali. Soap needs a lot of it, and until the late 18th century, the only sources were plant ash and mineral deposits, both limited. Europe was burning through forests and importing barilla ash from Spain, and demand kept outrunning supply. The answer came from France in the 1790s, when a chemist named Nicolas Leblanc developed a process for producing soda ash from common salt. It was harsh, polluting industrial chemistry. The process released hydrogen chloride gas and produced foul sulfurous waste that damaged surrounding land. But it worked, and it turned alkali from a scarce agricultural product into a manufactured commodity. Leblanc himself did poorly out of it. His patent was seized during the Revolutionary period, and he died in poverty. A cleaner and more efficient process developed by Ernest Solvay later replaced his method. Around the same time, the French Chemist Michel-Eugène Chevreul worked out what saponification actually is, identifying the fatty acids and glycerol involved. After thousands of years of empirical practice, soap making finally had a theory behind it. Cheap alkali plus understood chemistry meant soap prices collapsed through the 19th century. Combined with the repeal of soap taxes, soap moved within reach of ordinary households for the first time in its history. This detail is worth sitting with directly because the availability of soap and the understanding of why it matters arrived almost simultaneously, and that timing changed everything. The understanding part is a truly painful story. In the 1840s, a physician named Ignaz Semmelweis was working in a Vienna maternity hospital with two clinics. One was staffed by doctors and medical students, the other by midwives. The maternal death rate from childbed fever in the doctor's clinic was dramatically higher, and this was well known. Women reportedly begged to be admitted to the midwives' clinic. Semmelweis worked out that the doctors were coming directly from performing autopsies to examining women in labor, carrying something on their hands. He instituted hand-washing with a chlorinated lime solution. Deaths in the affected clinic dropped sharply. He was largely rejected. His conclusion implied that respected physicians were killing their patients, which was not a welcome message, and he could not offer a mechanism because germ theory did not yet exist. His career deteriorated, his behavior became increasingly erratic, and he was committed to an asylum where he died within weeks, reportedly after being beaten by staff from an infected wound. Germ theory arrived shortly after through the work of Pasteur, Koch, and Lister, and Semmelweis was vindicated posthumously. Only then did hand-washing acquire a rationale, and only then did soap's role change from cleaning things to preventing disease. Let's talk about the modern complication too, because this represents a twist most people never hear about. Much of what we wash with today is not soap. Traditional soap has a real weakness. In hard water, rich in calcium and magnesium, it reacts to form an insoluble scum that sticks to skin, hair, fabric, and bathtubs. During the First World War, fat shortages in Germany drove chemists to develop alternatives, and synthetic detergents emerged. Molecules with the same dual-ended structure, but built so they do not precipitate in hard water. Most laundry products, dish liquids, shampoos, and many bars sold as beauty bars are detergents rather than soap in the strict chemical sense. There is also the antibacterial question. Soaps with added antibacterial agents were marketed heavily for decades. Regulators later concluded that manufacturers had not demonstrated these were more effective than plain soap and water for general consumer use, and that certain ingredients raised safety and resistance concerns, leading to restrictions on several of them. For ordinary hand washing, plain soap and adequate scrubbing remains the standard advice. Let's talk about how soap got sold too, because this represents an underrated part of how it actually reached people. Cheap soap alone does not create a hand-washing population. Habits had to change, and that change was driven substantially by advertising. Soap manufacturers were among the earliest and most aggressive users of mass consumer marketing. 19th century soap firms produced illustrated advertisements, distributed printed cards, sponsored competitions, and pushed brand names into public consciousness on a scale that had not been attempted for an everyday product before. Some of the largest consumer goods companies in the world today trace their origins directly to soap manufacturing in this period. The genre of the radio and television serial drama got the nickname soap opera because detergent and soap makers sponsored the programs, aiming at exactly the audience making household purchasing decisions. That marketing history has a darker side worth naming directly. A great deal of soap advertising from the colonial era used explicitly racist imagery, presenting cleanliness as a civilizing mission and using degrading depictions of colonized peoples to sell products to European consumers. These advertisements are well documented and are now studied as examples of how commercial imagery reinforced imperial ideology. The hygiene message that accompanied all this was also uneven in who it reached. Soap became affordable, but access to clean running water did not follow at the same pace, and in many places still has not. Hand-washing guidance is only useful where there is water to wash with, and a substantial share of the world's population still lacks reliable access to a basic hand-washing facility at home. The technology stopped being the limiting factor a long time ago. The infrastructure around it remains one. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. If the question is when humans invented soap, the answer is somewhere around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, with the caveat that the discovery of fat plus ashes was probably accidental and probably happened repeatedly in multiple places. If the question is when humans invented soap as we understand it, the answer is much later. Hard bar soap with controlled alkali in the medieval Islamic world, industrial scale cheap soap in 19th century Europe. And if the question is when humans understood what soap was for, the answer is barely more than 150 years ago, within the lifetime of the great-great-grandparents of people alive today. That last gap is the striking part. We had the technology for 5 millennia and the reason for 1.5 centuries. Soap sat in human hands through the fall of empires, through plagues that emptied cities, through the deaths of countless people who could have been saved by a bucket of water and a bar of something they already knew how to make. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. The most effective public health tool ever devised was invented thousands of years before anyone realized it was a public health tool at all. Which raises the question of what else is already sitting on the shelf, waiting for somebody to work out what it does.